In this episode, Dr. Ray explains why the phrase "a man can get pregnant" has no logical structure. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shannon Ray. In today's episode, I'm going to extend the argument that I was making in the previous episode, which is why I have such an issue with all of this gender ideology stuff. And like I was saying in the previous discussion I had with Ray, a lot of my issue comes from these moral claims that are being made and the lack of logical structure associated with the ideas being proposed. You know, as an academic and as a scholar and as a person of reason, it really does bother me that it seems like our institutions of knowledge producing have unleashed a set of ideas that have no logical structure behind them. And this is something that I said to Ray in the conversation, was that the phrase "a man can get pregnant" objectively makes no sense. Like, it has no logical structure. And one thing he said back to me was, you're taking that phrase out of context. Within the context of a person getting gender reassignment surgery, that phrase makes perfect sense because they're talking about a biological woman. So in their context, that makes perfect sense. But the problem with that is he's proposing that getting cosmetic surgery literally makes you a man. And so the thing about that is, in the traditional definition of man and woman, this would not make you a man or a woman. Like, you wouldn't literally be a man or a woman. So this means that there has to be some other language structure that imbues meaning on the symbols man and woman to make that phrase coherent. So what this reminds me of is an example I gave in the episode "Is Context All the Way Down?", where I talk about the idea of someone saying 2 plus 2 doesn't always equal 4. Who said 2 plus 2 can't equal 5? And in the episode, I go on a little rant where I point out that there's two options for this phrase. Either the symbols 2, plus, equal, and 4, and 5 are given meaning through the language of mathematics that has been developed over centuries, in which case that is objectively false, or you are removing those symbols from that context such that 2 plus 2 equals 5 is not invalid. But then you have the problem that you no longer have that language to imbue meaning on those symbols, so that phrase is meaningless. So yeah, 2 plus 2 can equal 5, but it has absolutely no meaning until you create some context, some language that imbues meaning on these symbols such that that statement is coherent. So as far as I can tell, that's the exact same situation the gender ideology people are in. They have a phrase, "a man can get pregnant," which is equivalent to 2 plus 2 equals 5. And I have to ask, well, what does that mean? And so that's the purpose of this episode right here, is to analyze the language, the supposed language that makes that coherent, and to point out that the definition of man and woman being used in that language has no information. It has no logical structure, and as such, it cannot be used to manifest objectivity in communication. So that's the point of this episode. So to make my argument, we first have to understand how information works. So for anyone who has been listening to this podcast enough, they will be probably sick of me explaining how information works. But for those of you who are new and are interested in this argument that I'm making, let me just be quick to summarize. So information functions as a border. It functions as a constraint. As a border, it can demarcate a space from that which is consistent with the information from that which is not consistent with the information. So the whole point of information is that it excludes. I mean, while you're listening to me in this recording, I am providing information which is placing context to what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about puppies right now. I'm talking about concepts that are consistent with the words that have been spoken so far. And so a quick example that I always use, and I'm sure, again, people are sick of hearing, is imagine someone has a completely clear mind. They're not thinking about anything. Think like a white piece of paper. And in this state of clear mind, they have the capacity to think about anything because they're thinking about nothing. So then imagine that they go from thinking about nothing to a human. So suddenly you've taken the space of all things one could be imagining, you've taken that space and you've reduced it only down to human. So that's what the information human does. And then if I say, okay, well, what if instead of human, I'm thinking of an American, someone with American citizenship. Now suddenly the space of human gets demarcated again. And now there's a smaller set of people that are consistent with the information provided. And then I can add additional information, Black American, it shrinks again. And so every single time you add information, you exclude that which is inconsistent, and then you have the things that are consistent, and those things are all symmetric with respect to the information that has been provided. And to quantify the number of things or the amount of things that are consistent with given information is entropy. That's what entropy is. So the conclusion is, the nature of information is to function as a border. The nature of information is to exclude. And the degree to which we all agree on a word is the degree to which we can collectively exclude things that are not consistent with information such that we can communicate. So that if someone comes to you and says, I am a UFC champion, or I am the UFC welterweight champion of the world, because we all understand what those words are, we can exclude everybody except for Bilal Muhammad. That points to Bilal Muhammad. Period. And anyone claiming to be a UFC welterweight champion of the world who's not Bilal Muhammad is objectively wrong. That's how information works. So the point is what I want to demonstrate is that this definition of man as it is proposed in gender ideology has no capacity to demarcate the space of humans into subsets or into subspaces. And we can see this by looking at the traditional definition of man and woman. So in the traditional definition, the definitions of man and woman demarcate the space of humans based off of sex. So humans who produce sperm or whose bodies are designed to produce sperm and in general have penises, testicles, and do not give birth are men. And humans who produce eggs or whose bodies are designed to produce eggs and in general have vaginas, breasts, and do give birth are women. So these are all sex characteristics that can demarcate this space. And it should be noted that just because information may be fuzzy, meaning that it doesn't have the capacity to clearly demarcate the space in 100% certainty under all circumstances, doesn't mean that there objectively isn't a border. So just because the border may have some fuzziness to it, doesn't mean that there is no border. And so now let's compare that to the new definition of man and woman proposed by gender ideology that's supposedly supposed to place meaning on the phrase "a man can get pregnant." So in gender ideology, what they do is they take these labels, man and women, and they turn them into umbrella terms. And within each umbrella, you have the labels cis and non-cis. So a cis man is someone who was assigned male at birth and who identifies as a male or a man. And a non-cis man would be someone who was assigned male at birth and does not identify as a man. And the same goes for cis woman and non-cis woman. So the thing that's important here is we have to ask ourselves, what does the umbrella term mean? So you have the word man above, and then imagine below that you have cis man and non-cis man. So the question then becomes, what does that umbrella term mean? And the reason why they're able to make these categories is based off this idea that someone can identify as something separate from their sex. So the definition, as far as I can tell anywhere I look, is that a man is anyone who identifies as a man and a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. But we can see that within these umbrella terms, that both man and woman contain humans of both biological sexes. The definition of woman in this context includes both biological men and biological women. Same goes for man. And so we can see that this is in contrast to the old definition of man, because you're no longer using sex to demarcate the space of humans into subsets. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the basis on which they can demarcate the space? Because what I'm essentially saying is that once you untether the definition from sex, you don't have any capacity to demarcate this space, especially when it's based off of self-identification. Because again, if you're going on a date with someone, they say that the person you're going on a date with is a man using this definition, you would actually be considered a bigot for assuming that it's a person with penis and testicles. You see, because this definition could include someone who isn't traditionally a man, but identifies as one. So in that moment, you can't anticipate what type of person you're going to see. The only thing you can anticipate is that they identify as a man. So my assertion is that this has no capacity to demarcate the space of human into subspaces. And I imagine that someone may protest this and say that the concepts of man and woman are not determined by sex alone, and that they also depend on behaviors and self-expression. Thus, these new definitions can alternatively subdivide the category human based on these characteristics. So I'd imagine that someone might make the argument that, hey, what a man is and what a woman is isn't entirely based off of sex. It can be based off of how you express yourself and the behaviors and what you're interested in and things like that. And so we know for a fact that they're not using sex, because with these new umbrella terms, both umbrella terms include people of both biological sexes. So sex is not the thing that determines it. Instead, it's this self-identification. And this self-identification is usually based off of some stereotypical understanding of how men behave and dress and how women behave and dress, which is something that is constantly shifting with cultures all the time. And for those stereotypes to have meaning, you have to have a consensus that people say, yeah, if you act this way, then you are a man. Without a society coming to consensus that this particular behavior that is independent of your sex trait can only be done by men, without that, there really is no way for us to create an objective understanding of what these words mean. And so to point out the flaw in this idea of trying to tie the definitions of man and women to behavior and self-expression, I want to use an example that I call the Esteban woman. I have a friend named Esteban. He is a very masculine presenting man. All his sexual dimorphic traits are that of a man. His views on men and women are very masculine, and his physical aesthetics is consistent with a man's. So he dresses like a man, acts like a man, talks like a man, sounds like a man, of what people would consider traditionally a man. Now imagine if he said tomorrow that he identified as a woman and he really meant it, except nothing about how he behaves, thinks, or expresses himself has changed. With these new definitions proposed by gender ideology, there is no basis to tell him he is not a woman. Furthermore, one can't make an argument that he must change something about himself to be taken seriously as a woman without implicitly saying that a woman who behaves, thinks, and expresses herself exactly like Esteban is not really a woman. This is the main crux of the problem. When I see the female gangster character Snoop from The Wire, I see a person who could be replaced by a man and nobody would bat an eye. That is, she is a representation of what I call the Esteban woman. But at no point while watching the show did I think she was a man. Because if you watch the show, she's a gangster woman. Like, she exactly behaves like a gangster would, a very masculine woman. Instead, I thought, there is nothing about this woman's behavior that revokes her woman card. She is still a woman despite how she acts and presents herself. This is why Esteban claiming he's a woman without changing anything about himself must be accepted under this new ideology. Otherwise, you'd have to be saying something like the Esteban woman is really a man, or you'd have to deny the Esteban woman's womanhood based on her behavior and presentation. So the problem with trying to define man and woman independent of sex is there are no behaviors that can't be adopted by a man or a woman outside of their sexual functions. Like getting pregnant, for example. Just because a woman acts and presents and behaves in very traditional masculine ways like a man, that does not mean that she's an actual man. And you'll notice this a lot with gender ideology, is that they often fall back on stereotypes to identify whether or not someone is a man or a woman. And you hear criticism from people and from the gay community where you'll hear a gay person say, well, I'm really glad that I grew up gay, in the 70s, because someone would have saw me doing all this boy stuff and told me that I was a boy. So this trying to tether it to behavior and self and expression doesn't really make any sense. And I would imagine that in the case of Snoop from The Wire, that if Snoop says she's a woman, no one would say that she isn't. But if Snoop said that she's a man, nobody would say that she isn't. This is the problem. Where she falls in the category of man and woman completely determines on how she feels and her personal feeling and expression, which is a subjective feeling. We don't have access to it, right? So we don't have access to someone's subjective feeling. And because of that, that's the reason why it can't be used for communication. There's nothing objective. Like if you listen to this podcast, you'll notice that I spend a lot of effort trying to create a language based off of things that everyone can verify. Like just go back and listen to any episode where I explain what I am doing and why. It's constantly referencing back to, well, to build consensus, we got to use things that everyone can verify. That's why this physical matter and energy is considered like reality, because someone can make claims about reality based on that, and then other people can do experiments and verify it so that we can build consensus on what reality is. That's how we build consensus. What is the mutual information between you and me? This is why when someone creates a movie, like I was watching, I just finished watching Lost for the first time. And for the last episode of that show and the episode before that, I was crying almost the entire time. Because whatever it is that the creators of that show captured that inspired them to produce that art, it resonated with me. And so there's something within them that can resonate with something within me. And this is another way in which we build consensus and a bridge between each other. For example, I know for a fact that because we're both human, to make that last example a little more clear, because we're both human, I can have some certainty that I understand what you would experience if you stubbed your toe, right? We're both humans. We know that if we break each other's finger, like I know without knowing your subjective reality, I can be pretty certain what it would feel like for you to break your finger, right? That's mutual information. This is how we build consensus. So ultimately what I'm saying is that this definition of man and woman that they've provided has no capacity to demarcate the space of human. Therefore, it has no information. And on top of that, the definition seems to be based on a circular argument. Because if this new language untethers itself from biology and instead tethers itself to self-identification, the obvious question is, what are they identifying as? What is man on this umbrella term? Yeah, so essentially what you're seeing is something like, I identify as a man. Well, what is a man? A man is anyone who identifies as a man. So what are you identifying as? That's essentially the circular argument that's going on here. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that these definitions of man and women have no meaning. So the next question I want to ask to bring my point home is, what would happen if we adopted this method for creating identities, for all identities that could be had? So in other words, if it is the case that gender ideologists are asserting that self-identification is a valid means to impose meaning on an identification. So it's something like they're claiming that self-identification is a valid means for placing meaning on a symbol or a label. If that's the case, then why not apply it to every identity possible? And this is something that I brought up in the conversation with Ray. Why not apply that to every identity possible? Why can't a physicist be anyone who identifies as a physicist? Why can't a UFC champion be anyone who identifies as a UFC champion? Why can't a lawyer be anyone who identifies as a lawyer? Why can't being black is anyone who identifies as black? Like, why is this particular identity on man and woman a special case? Either this thing is somehow a special case, or you take this mode of defining identities, which is self-identification, and apply it consistently across the board. And I think we all can see what would happen if we did that. There would be no means to ever deny anyone's claim to an identity. Anyone's claim to an identity would always be valid. Therefore, every single identity would validate every characteristic. There would be no capacity to demarcate or categorize people at all. Like, you have to see that. Self-identification, because it's the only criteria, means that no matter what you look like, no matter what you act like, no matter how you behave, no matter what you do, if you say the magic words, I identify as X, then you are X. That's how this would have to work. So that means that every identity would validate every characteristic and mode of being. There is no demarcation of anything into anything. Period. So this is what we're dealing with here. And I find it absolutely remarkable that this idea has gained as much power as it has. How? To me, the idea that a man is anyone who identifies as a man is to language as flat earth is to science. That's how bad it is. And what bothers me is that people really love mocking others who believe the earth is flat. How stupid are you? That's obviously nonsense. How dumb are you? You might as well believe the moon is made of cheese. Or what an idiot. But then when it comes to something like a man is identified as anyone who identifies as a man, then suddenly half the population thinks that this is a valid thing to say. Not only that, but they'll tell you are immoral if you don't agree with someone's self-identification. This is madness that is beyond comprehension, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my feelings towards trans people. Like, I sat on a plane the other day next to a trans person. Every person at the local pet stores that I go to are all trans. And I know that when I go and I pay for my food, my dog food or whatever, and I'm interacting with them, there is nothing swelling up in my heart. There's no hatred. There's no anger. It's just nothing. I don't have any negative feelings at all. It's just, I am a scholar. I am an academic. I am a knowledge producer. I'm a person of logic and I'm a person of reason. And morals and ethics are extremely important to me. I think you'd probably know that if you listen to the podcast and you see how much effort I'm putting in to create a language so that we can all come together as one. And to see a set of ideas that are antithetical to everything that I value, and then watch it gain power through coercion and telling people if you don't agree, then you're bad. You're just justifying bad behavior. It's like, no, I'm not. You have to really stop and think about what the hell is going on here. This makes no sense. And again, anyone who listens to this, come onto the podcast. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why I'm immoral. I swear I will be so nice to you because I truly, truly care about truth more than anything. If someone can explain to me why I'm wrong, I would be more than happy to hear it. But it seems absolutely crystal clear that a man is anyone who identifies as a man is not a valid statement. And this is why the statement a man can get pregnant is totally invalid. This language, and I say that in quotes, that gender ideology has produced is not a language. It can't be used to manifest the spirit of objectivity because it has no logical structure that is independent of anyone's feelings. I mean, this is the thing that's so important about logical structures is that they come with about logic is that it comes with a causal structure. When X, then Y because of Z, such that I can hand you the algorithm or the syntax of a language and then leave. I don't even have to be there. And you can start using it to comprehend, to think, to write code. I don't need to be there. But if the definitions are a man who identifies as a man and things like this, then you need the other person. You need the other person there to tell you. I don't know if that argument makes perfect. I don't know if that argument is that great, but anyway, I hope this makes sense. I hope that people understand where my frustration is coming from, and I hope that if you hadn't been thinking about these ideas deeply, that this has provided you with some clarity and some understanding. I hope that if you're someone who really clings on to these ideas, that you sincerely contact me and tell me why I'm wrong. Please share this with anyone that you think might find it useful, and also share it with other people who want to have an argument for why they're not bigots for disagreeing with the statement that a man can get pregnant. Anyway, stay turtling, my friends. Peace.